Welcome back to The Courage to Speak with me, Leonie Mellinger, the podcast that asks, what does it take to have the courage to speak up and speak out in life? My guest today, Dame Harriet Walter, is an acclaimed and award-winning actress who has worked extensively in theatre, television, film and radio. She began working with the groundbreaking theatre groups Joint Stock, 784 and Payne's Plough, before moving on to leading roles at the Royal Court, the National Theatre and Royal Shakespeare Company, where she won the Olivier Award for Best Actress for her performances in Twelfth Night and Three Sisters. Other awards include the Olivier for Best Actress in A Question of Geography, the Evening Standard Award for Best Actress in Mary Stuart, for which she also received Tony and Olivier Award Best Actress nominations. She recently received Emmy nominations for Outstanding Guest Actress for Succession and the comedy series Ted Lasso, and also a BAFTA nomination for Best Supporting Actress for Succession. Harriet's numerous films include performances in Sense and Sensibility, The Governess, Atonement, Star Wars The Force Awakens, The Sense of an Ending and Rocket Man. In 2011, Harriet was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to drama. As a writer, her books include Brutus and Other Heroines, playing Shakespeare's roles for women, Facing It, Reflections on Images of Older Women, Macbeth, Portrait of a Marriage, and Other People's Shoes. Thoughts on Acting, described by one reviewer as an unaffected tribute to the power of art in the theatre and a fascinating insight into the working life of an actor. Harriet is working on a new book entitled She Speaks, which is due out in October. Harriet, welcome. I am so looking forward to talking to you on this subject. It seems to me that there's this misconception that all actors are naturally outgoing and gregarious and can talk anywhere, anytime about anything. But I think you and I probably know that's not the case.
I think almost the opposite is true. I think because our inclination is to disappear into other characters, and we've had a lifetime of speaking other people's thoughts, I think we find it hard to own our own thoughts and express our own thoughts, or there's a reluctance to do that, which makes you kind of express yourself through other people.
Yes, almost rub yourself out sometimes.
Yes, but then increasingly you become very self-aware, and self-conscious goes with that.
Yes.
And when you're self-conscious, you don't want to speak.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. So I'd be interested to find out, first of all, what you were like, and then go through the different stages and find out what you're like today.
Yes.
So, as a child, were you shy or were you outgoing? What were you like?
I wish I could kind of figure it out, because I was a mixture of shy and showing off, which I suppose that's an actor, isn't it?
An actor, absolutely, yeah.
I was the youngest, and of only two, but you know, if you've got a sibling that's just 3 years older than you, just faster than you, just bigger than you, just cleverer than you, you grow up feeling a bit sort of like you want to catch up and make your mark.
Yes.
And also, I was sort of academically quite bright, so I was always in a form with older people, you know, usually in a form with, you know, I was on the young end of the form. So, you know, you didn't feel as big and important as some of the people around you when you were little.
Yeah.
But I made up for it, because I think I was encouraged to be sort of funny, or...
By your parents?
I think, yes, I think I got laughed at.
Oh, right.
I mean, laughed
in
with.
In a good way.
Yes, and I thought, oh, that's a way of getting through.
Yes. And what were your parents like? Did you take more after your mother or your father? Or?
My mother was more emotionally demonstrative. But both my parents, I would say, were quite shy. Right. They were that mixture as well. They were very gregarious and social, but, you know, sort of, they had quite a lot of insecurities about themselves, which is, I've always thought was strange, because they were both very beautiful and glamorous.
Yes. And
always were sort of asked out to this and out to that, and were part of the party. but I sensed they were quite inhibited, really, and their own family background had made them feel not terribly important, I think.
Okay. And what about at school?
I was always good at making friends, but often they were one-to-ones. I was not a gang member, or, I liked being with my bestie in the corner.
Yes.
Even though I might change those besties from time to time, or they changed me.
And did you act at school at all?
I was very reluctant to act.
Really?
Yes. I mean, funny enough, my sister and I used to, kids always do put on plays, and she was always the motive and the motor.
Oh, right.
And seemed to be the one who was going to be the extrovert. Looking back on it, that's so not the case. She's incredibly shy now. But again, I think shy being the other side of the coin of self-conscious.
Yes.
And so we did plays at home, which got very well received. We had a thing called the acting club in the garden.
Yes.
Which was just a shed, which we put a nail varnish red paint sort of sign saying acting club, and it was all dripping. And the local kids came round, and my sister probably made up all the stories. Of course, now she recounts that as being, well, my younger sister forced me to have an acting club. So who knows which is true?
I read in your wonderful book, Other People's Shoes, all sorts of things which I want to talk about, but you just reminded me of one where during one of these shows at home to your parents and friends of parents, you suddenly heard this voice saying, "Now you're just showing off."
Yes.
That must have been absolutely ghastly.
Terrible. And why did that sting so much that I remember it to this day? You see, some other kid might have been told to stop showing off and it didn't kill them.
Yeah,
whereas to me it was like, I was so aware that that's exactly what I was doing that it stung me. Yes, and then at school, we did do school plays, and very early on I hid under the desk, I remember.
Really?
When they said who wants to be in the play. So I really didn't want to do it until quite a lot later.
And I know also that the divorce of your parents had a huge effect, to the point that you actually stopped going to school for a while.
Yes, that was a sort of dark moment.
Yeah.
I remember, because they sent me home because I was in a bit of it was called a nervous breakdown, but I don't know what you'd call it now.
Yeah.
And I was sent home. It was boarding school, and I thought I was going back for a weekend. And then on the Sunday they said, "You're not going back, you're not going back ever."
Goodness.
And I hadn't really said goodbye to anybody, but the main thing was, but I'm in the play. I can't not be there. And I remember to this day who took over my part.
Oh my God. My goodness me.
That was the worst thing.
How extraordinary. And then you went to a new school where you were able to reinvent yourself. You said, yes.
Yes, that was sort of what I did.
That must have been quite liberating.
It was, definitely. And I do think that's perhaps an opportunity we get as actors, because every time you go into a new company, you're in a different role, literally playing a different part, and you're also perhaps in a different sort of place in the hierarchy or age group or whatever. And so you can start on a clean page sometimes. It's quite, or when you travel abroad and you can, I love that idea of reinventing yourself, but then of course you don't really. I think I live with the fact that that we are all, and I am sort of chameleons, and we adapt to our environment. And somebody said to me in a Q&A, does it not bother you when you play lots of parts, which is you and which is the part, And I sort of thought, it's quite a well-known question, and I don't know a new way to answer it.
Yes.
And I suddenly came out, well, does it matter who I am? Because it doesn't really matter, you don't have to hold on to this one way you've presented yourself.
Well, exactly. We are all different versions of ourselves all the time, and so it's a bit of a strange question that I know actors get asked all the time. How do I know it's really you? Yeah. And you think, oh, for goodness sake, this is it.
The assumption also is that if you can pretend to feel things, then you must be you're not reliable.
Exactly.
You're a liar.
Exactly.
I think there's that goes on as well.
So I gather then before going to drama school, you went to Oxford.
I didn't actually
Not to study, but was it just...
No, what happened was I got a place at Oxford to read modern languages, but it hadn't been my wish to go to university.
Right.
It came from my grandfather.
Okay.
And modern languages was my strong suit, and I thought particularly that subject, why would you learn that in the middle of Oxfordshire rather than going to the countries and studying them there? I didn't really understand what university was, or what it wasn't something that was in my in my vision at all, and I had wanted to go to drama school from the age of 13 or something.
Oh, right, okay.
So I kind of overrode that offer with the blessing of my father, which was quite good of him.
Right.
Because it didn't come from him either, it came from his father, and as I say, he was slightly sort of trying to get his father. So I think everything worked in my favour that I turned that down and went to drama school instead. But in the intervening year or 18 months that I had to wait, I went to Cambridge just to hang out.
Oh, it was Cambridge.
Cambridge, and I did a secretarial course, which my father thought was a good idea. He'd been to Cambridge. He was quite happy that I sort of experienced that kind of Oxbridge atmosphere.
Yes.
And there, of course, because it was the days of all female, all male colleges and only 3 female colleges, there were lots of spare parts going for women in the plays.
Right.
And that was interesting because the women at the colleges had to work harder. So they had to be very earnest pupils and study, where their male counterparts were sort of wearing long floppy scarves and riding around on bicycles and doing drugs. I mean, that was slightly the impression. So I hung out with those people and did quite a lot of plays.
And I gather that you went off on a trip to South Africa with a...
Yes, that was
quite controversial, wasn't it?
It was, and I was, if you can imagine, I was a very sheltered. I'd been a debutante. I had never been outside of the sort of class my parents grew up in, which was possible in those days. It's not possible now. Everybody's much more mixed up, luckily. But I was then thrown into what was then a much more socially mobile Cambridge.
Yes.
There were many more people from grammar schools and secondary moderns and who were there. It was much more socially mobile than it's now receded to. And so I was thrown into a completely different kind of company. And then with them, I was sort of politicised in a way that I had absolutely nothing in my background to prepare me for. And Trinity College had an acting company called the Dryden Society, I think it still does, and they had an annual tour to an English-speaking country, performing Shakespeare and one modern play. And my boyfriend at the time was a director and said, why don't you audition? And I did and got in, and that year they were going to South Africa, which I just thought was part of Southern Africa. I didn't know about apartheid, I didn't know anything, I was so ignorant. And there was a big sort of student boycott of this tour because it was part of a cultural boycott. And nevertheless, people decided to go. And after that, I was sort of in a strange position. I thought, well, would I argue for or against a cultural boycott? It's quite an interesting question because we were not being, we overrode the kind of intention of the establishment to make us part of their, the sort of South African, not the government, we weren't important to the government, but sort of people like the establishment in Fort Hare University, which is the Black African university, who were all white. They wanted to use us to sort of make a point of, they kind of brought us under their wing, and we got really out from under their wing and told them that was absolutely not who we were. Fantastic. So we got the chance to say that. We then met the students at the university and stuff like that.
Yes.
And we went to Soweto and played in mixed, and sort of where we could, mixed audiences or all African audiences. And so there were conditions that we set ourselves to kind of make this a worthwhile journey. And it was 3 months, and 3 months of intense experience. And anger and upset and horror.
Yes.
It was just
sounds incredibly
a ghastly,
intense.
ghastly system. And you came home and sort of somehow saw the world through that.
So you must have been a bit of a different Harriet.
I very
coming
much
home.
was.
Yeah,
I very much was.
absolutely. And then you went to Lambda.
Yes.
And what one of the things that fascinated me that I read in your book was that you tried to hide your background because you were fearful of being seen as posh. And I can't imagine how difficult that must have been.
It wasn't even that. It was, I suppose, partly this politicisation that had happened that started, made me see what the class system did.
Yeah.
And also, just on an artistic level, I didn't want to be bracketed in a group, and I didn't want to be judged, as we do in this country, by my manners and my accent. And, I wanted to be open to everybody and everything, which of course is impossible, but I wanted to start with that attempt. And as I say, it was much more socially mobile. There were no other posh people in my year, really, not the sort of posh I'd come from.
Yeah. But did you manage to hide for a bit?
For a bit. Yes. And then, of course, the more I got close to people, the more I said, well, do come back to my house. And then I go, oh, God. Slightly. I mean, Ian Charlson, who I loved a lot, for whom the prize is named, and who was a wonderful actor, was in my year.
Oh.
And I was actually living with my stepfather and mother, and he had lots of money. My parents didn't have much money, but my stepfather did. And Ian came back to our house and said, oh, 2 ovens. They would have 2 ovens. And I thought, I don't even cook. Shut up, Things like that. So it did. It took a bit of guts to have people back to.
I bet it did.
But in another way, I thought, well, bite it. This is who I am. Don't judge. I'm not going to judge you by what your parents' house looks like. So.
But then, did you carry that on? Because then you went into companies like 784 and Joint Stock, and so. Did they know your background?
Yeah, yes, I think they did, yes.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, I sort of teased myself about it and they teased me about it, and it was all absolutely fine. And I remember somebody saying, I'm a socialist because my parents, my family's always been socialist or something. And I said, I'm a socialist because none of my family is socialist. It just became a sort of joke, but in fact, I'm glad I went that route. It sounds, for the subject matter we're talking about, it sounds as though I was very vocal and political and activist, and really I wasn't.
Yeah.
I was again relying on other people to write the words, to write the plays. I just wanted to hitch a ride on that particular wagon rather than, I suppose, sort of do a West End play where I play the Juve lead or, something much more conventional.
Yeah.
And because I thought it was A, more interesting, and B, I did think the world needed changing.
Yeah, and through the theatre.
Through the theatre, yeah.
But you wrote in your book that you were not confident enough to speak up about women not being centre stage there, and centre of the narrative, and to fit in you had to become one of the lads. Mm-hmm. So you obviously had to do that, so drink beer and talk rugby and stuff like that.
It never went quite that far, but I did join a darts match in Cornwall. But no, I think what happened was that was a particular show in Joint Stock where I was the only woman.
Yes.
And we went on tour, and they were gorgeous guys. They weren't sort of horrible.
Yeah.
But they weren't sort of laddish lads in a way.
Right.
But I think my instinct is to fit in.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel comfortable. I don't like being the abrasive grit in the oyster that makes the pearl. I like just sizing up what's appropriate and moving in and fitting in. And in other companies which I'd been in 784, for instance, where there were other women and the focus was sometimes on women, there was a whole lot of sort of what I would call loosely socialist Marxist theatre companies at the time.
Yeah.
All the women in those companies were invited to get together and talk about how their voices were not heard environment, and some were only the only woman in that company, and some were one of two, and some were one of three, and it was rather great that we all got together and heard, oh gosh, that happens to me too, you know.
So did you join in?
I did. Yeah. I remember very much going to this. I think I only went to one or two gatherings, but it was just very refreshing to know that, you know, that this was actually on the table, you know, it was a thing, and particularly a thing in the labour movement, actually, that you know, there was revolution and equality for everybody, but women were kind of dragged up at the very last minute. But yes, of course, and them too, you know. But
it was, and still is to some extent. It was very difficult, I think, still for actresses at that time. I mean, I remember when you and I were in the RSC, there was a women's group.
Absolutely, I remember that.
But I remember I, at that time, didn't have the courage to say anything at all. So, but
I don't know if I did, except I remember christening us the Wimps, women in men's parts. but it was partly because we were doing we were being quite joke. It was a big forum we gathered at the RSC. Yes. I say we.
Yes.
I was not instrumental in gathering it. There were some, as I say, that, you know, there were some more vocal people.
Sheila Hancock
and people like that who got it, who convened it, and from it evolved the Women's Playhouse Trust, which became Sphinx Theatre.
Yes.
You know, all those things came out of that big convention.
Yeah.
And I remember it. And no, I wouldn't have spoken out at that, except to make a little quip.
Yes.
There you are.
Yeah, there we
go.
A
little joke.
Yes.
And it was a safe environment, really. It wasn't that I felt threatened. And I also think that a lot of male actors feel intimidated to speak out, because we are in that position where, you know, if we criticise the situation, our jobs are fragile. We can be easily replaced. So I think the environment of any actor, male or female, is quite threatening in that way. And there's lip service paid to you can speak out and you can say, particularly after, you know, Me Too and everything. But it's still difficult, I bet you, to actually say things, because you get labelled, you know, difficult or a problem, or people are very defensive.
There are now some actors who are incredibly courageous about it, but there is still this fear, isn't there, that if you say something, people might go, oh, particularly I think more for women even than men, you can be labelled as difficult.
Totally.
Or over emotional, or, you know, those sorts of things are much more easily said to women.
I think they're almost exclusively said to women.
Yeah.
I think for exactly the same, we might do exactly the same thing or say the same thing, or, you know, and our gesture is labelled difficult, and where a man's is just sort of, you know, oh, good old him.
Good on him, yeah, I know, yeah, exactly. So do you feel that you've done the speaking out now through that you're doing it through the acting and your writing as well? Because, you know, you've also done that interesting book, you know, about women's faces. So
yes.
So I think what I that way.
I think, yes, I'm much more someone who would sort of collect my thoughts in tranquility and write them down.
Yes.
I'm much more happy doing that, where I can consider exactly what I mean. And whereas, you know, I suppose I don't trust myself, not particularly now. I mean, I'm not on social media, but I find the environment, from what I hear, is very frightening, and the number of times you can be misunderstood, misquoted. And I think I've always been very worried about being misunderstood. Do you know, I'm a communicator and I hate being misunderstood. I remember sort of as a kid, that would have been something you don't understand. You know, it's something that, you know, there's only any point to communicating your thoughts to somebody else, and that is to have them exactly transferred, which is an impossible thing, because everybody interprets everything through their own filter. But I just thought, well, I'm happier writing what I think, but also I have been known to get very front foot in certain situations, but only when something is overriding, like, you know, something is so wrong or something's going on that's so infuriating. I will actually speak. I have been known to say, you can't do that, blah, 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 it's not fair, blah, blah, blah.
So when has that happened?
Well, I remember doing it at the RSC.
Right.
When a certain director was saying something and I just stepped in. Not because, you know, and I would have been terrified, but because I suddenly felt I'm the person who can do this, there was a
Right.
sudden awareness that the person who was being attacked was not going to feel strong to do it. And it doesn't mean that I'm a wonderful hero, but it was quite nice to see that I had that in my equipment, that if something mattered enough, it would override my fear.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So that's what it takes, isn't it? Sometimes that you just can't not say it.
Exactly.
And you just have to do it. And I was going to ask you, because I know you've worked with people like Bill Gaskell, who had a name for being really terrifying on some occasions.
Yes.
And so was he terrifying?
He was terrifying. But the trouble is that I look on him as the person who taught me more than anything else. So quite a lot of the time you put up with certain things because there's some big reward in it. You know? I mean, I could probably say now, I could have learnt all that without him being cruel.
Yes.
But, I don't think it's a prerequisite of being a good teacher.
No.
But I did learn so much from him.
Yes.
And a word of praise from him was just,
gold dust.
Gold dust.
Yes.
But I think part of it, he was erratic. You didn't know which one you were going to get.
Yeah.
And I think that in all kinds of areas like parenting and teaching and everything is one of the golden rules. Be consistent, because if you're not, it's kind of, there's a whole other thing going on in the room which is not about learning or creating. It's just about second guessing who you're going to have to deal with today.
But you have this, you're so lovely and warm, and you fit in, as you say. And the House of Bernarda Alba, in which you were absolutely brilliant, you were so forbidding.
Yeah.
It must be quite fun to play that sort of character.
I don't know if it's fun, but because it's
not
not very happy to live with someone like that.
Oh, really?
Because someone like that is closing down everything. They're not opening up anything. They're kind of shutting shutters down. And there's another pleasure you get in a production like that, which is to do with the interplaying with everybody. It was a very ensemble piece, and it was very satisfying from that point of view. But I've just got this I've been cast as lots of scary people, and partly I sort of go, well, I don't think I'm scary. I know most scary people don't think they're scary, but I think that partly, you're saddled with how you look. You're saddled with prejudices people have about the way you look.
Yes.
And also, I'm quite good at playing them because I've observed people like that.
Right.
Because like a sort of, a mouse will know exactly what a cat does.
Yes.
Because it's survival to observe the thing that might get you.
Yes.
I think, from a very young age, I was sort of affected by somebody who scared me.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And so that printed itself on my memory, and I know how to reproduce that thing that frightened me.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes. So those characters, like the extraordinary Russian in Killing Eve.
Yeah, she was a bit of a one-off. I don't know many people like her, but no, I loved her.
And the brilliant mother in Succession. I mean, who was just ghastly. So you've obviously observed people like that.
They're all differently ghastly, as long as they're different.
Oh no, they're very different.
I'm happy. If I have to reproduce something I've already done, it's just a bit.
But so I'm interested that the times that you spoke up were really to jump in and defend somebody else.
Yes,
really.
yes.
And not really for you.
Yes, I think it is easier to speak up for other people than for yourself, actually.
But you recently, I think you spoke up on the subject of assisted dying, because I think, was that because you were playing a part?
And people approach you from all sorts of charities, and I did do 2 dramas that were associated with euthanasia or assisted dying, and I suppose word had got through to this organisation, Dignity in Dying, and they are currently fighting to get this really through Parliament, because the country at large is very much feeding to them that they're in favour of, in general, in favour. And of course people are frightened, and of course the lawmakers are more frightened than anybody else, but because of, possible abuse. But so I haven't spoken. I spoke up with them, but again, because I was asked to.
Yes.
And I think, I kind of sit back and wait to be asked, really, in a lot of situations. And then again, I want to sit and really frame what I want to say. And I sat down and wrote out what I wanted to say. I didn't kind of speak spontaneously at an event or anything like that.
Right. And I was interested that you wrote in your book, Other People's Shoes, in this country, the media like to keep actors in their place, i.e. the gossip columns. If we stray into more serious territory, we risk being called pretentious. So is that a fear then?
Yeah, I think there is a bit. Although when I wrote that book, it was 20 years ago, and I think people are much more used to actors having opinions and not, but it does annoy me if you sort of take up a cause. I remember there was a cause to sort of, at one point, to do with London, an area of London being carved up by a railway line and la la la. And I was sort of in a group of people who were trying to stop that happening. And a microphone was thrust in my face, and I said, I'd done my homework and I knew the facts and figures, and I said something about the facts and figures, and then I was asked, have you used this location as a film set, which I had, because it was part of London that's very, picturesque.
Yeah.
And when I watched the final cut on TV, they'd only talked about the fact that it was a film set. They didn't want an actor to argue a political case, even though it was, I'm a citizen of London.
Yeah.
And it was with that hat on that I was trying to defend this area. And that taught me a little lesson. I thought, I think that probably happened just before I wrote the book, and I was very much, that was in my head, that they don't want you to, and it has happened lots of times since, that I've done an interview or been quoted and only the bit that's a bit trivial has been quoted.
Frustrating though. And have you seen other actors or other people speak up and you've thought, that's very courageous, well done?
Yes, I do. I think there are people who, amongst my friends, who, I haven't asked them how much effort it took or how easy it was. For some people, it appears very, very easy and they're very eloquent, and then afterwards you hear that they're actually trembling, and they haven't given that away at all.
Yeah.
And I've even seen I've been part of events where somebody like, I don't know, a newscaster or someone who's out in front of the public all the time has been pacing up and down, getting nervous. So I don't suppose it's easy for anybody. But I also rather envy those people who don't give a damn what people think.
Yeah.
And they really don't get in a stew, and they just speak from the heart, and there's something about where they're coming from that gives them an authority, which I never feel I've got.
Really?
Sort of somebody who's speaking from an experience or from a class or a group that have certain life experiences and feel justified to talk about it. Whereas I'm usually talking on behalf of somebody else because my life is fine.
You have as much right as anybody to have a view.
Yes, to have a view,
yeah.
But I think it's seen as quite offensive if you haven't walk the walk,
right?
If you just talk the talk,
the lived experience, as they say. Yeah. But do you feel that having a profile, that you have a responsibility sometimes to speak on behalf of those whose voices might not otherwise be heard? Yes,
I do now. I've sort of woken up to my eldership, and that really, if I still care at this age what people think of me, there's something wrong with me. I ought to really be dropping that kind of inhibition, and but I also think there are, you're allowed to own your personality, and my personality is not someone who likes to be very extrovert and public. I'm as you can tell, I'm quite a talker. I don't mind, but in a 1-to-1 or 1-to-3 or I'm just not someone who would trust that eloquence I would have with a small group of people who I can roughly assume whose side they're on. Then when you're speaking to an unknown audience out there who might have all sorts of prejudices you can't control, you can't predict, that makes it quite worrying.
Absolutely. So I'm intrigued by the title of the book that you have coming out in October called She Speaks.
Yes, exclamation mark.
Yes. So what is that?
Well, I was asked to write one piece for just a challenge for something. Write a piece of a Shakespeare character in any way you like. You can invent a different story or whatever. And I wrote a piece for Gertrude, who I'd never played, but always thought I don't want to play her because she never gets to say what she feels.
Right.
So I wrote what Gertrude meant to say. And then I suddenly thought, this is fun, and went on and wrote 30 more. And they're mostly verse, in iambic pentameter mostly,
oh my goodness,
and rhymes, and some are in sonnet form, and some are more sort of free verse, I would say. But what I found was it was much harder to do what we call blank verse, i.e. it's in the right rhythm and it's written in columns, but it's not rhyming.
Yes.
Because then the quality of it is judged on how good a poet you are.
Yes,
do you see what I mean?
yes.
Whereas when you've got the structure of rhymes, it's sort of, how good are you at doggerel? Well, I don't mind saying I'm quite good at doggerel, but suddenly saying, actually I'm a poet. And yet, there you are again. I shouldn't do myself down. I think some of them are quite good, and there you go. If I didn't, I wouldn't be publishing them.
So you're imagining what they
Yes, I've written different stories for different people, or I've got characters together who don't meet from different plays.
How fascinating.
Like Hermione from Winter's Tale meets Imogen from Cymbeline, and they talk about how boring it is having a husband who's jealous of, and Mariana from Measure for Measure meets Diana from All's Well, and they discuss the bed trick, and stuff like that. It's quite fun.
Sounds
and
brilliant.
Ophelia doesn't die.
Oh, she doesn't. Hooray!
So stuff goes on. It's quite fun.
I look forward to that.
Great.
So this podcast is to speak to people about, as you know, having the courage to speak, and also finding it hard to speak, because I think most people find it really, really hard. And I know I have found it hard. I was so fascinated by the subject. But I'd like to ask what advice you would give someone who is afraid of speaking up. Is there anything you could say to encourage them?
Well, I would say, what I would love to be able to say is silence the critic. Don't get in your own head and say, this is rubbish, you're talking rubbish. Care about what you're saying and not about the fact that you're the one saying it. Try and forget the instrument and think of the message. If it's important enough, you can override your fear. I would say, plan what you're going to say very carefully, if you can.
Yes. If
it's a spontaneous thing, then good for you. And I think, particularly for women, just say, you've got absolutely every right to be vocal as a woman,
Yes.
And we cast ourselves in a sort of secondary role, and we should be casting ourselves in an equally primary role as men, so that what we have to say is as important as anything any man says. I think that's very hard for people to actually believe, because it's not in our tradition.
Such great advice. Thank you. Thank you so much, Harriet.
Great. I'll see you on the hustings.
Thanks for listening to The Courage to Speak, presented by me, Leonie Mellinger. The Courage to Speak is produced by Anushka Warden, with sound production by Theo Bosenket and music by Guy Pearson. For more information on The Courage to Speak, visit www.mellinger.co.uk.